Millionaire humiliates Nanny, but weeks later she saves his son's life and sparks a surprising change. Before clicking subscribe to learn more exciting stories like this and avoid 10 years of bad luck in love. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Lucy Thompson, a 25-year-old with hazel eyes and wavy brown hair, stopped in front of the imposing wrought iron gates. She looked up, gazing at the majestic mansion that stood before her, Oakwood Estate, home to one of the city's most influential families. Lucy took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of her freshly ironed white blouse. This was her first day as a nanny at the mansion, and she was determined to make a good impression. With trembling hands, she pressed the intercom button. "Good morning, I'm Lucy Thompson, the new nanny," she announced, hoping her voice wouldn't betray her nerves. After a brief silence, the gates opened with a metallic creak. Lucy walked up the gravel path, admiring the perfectly manicured gardens that flanked the entrance. Roses of all colors, precisely trimmed hedges, and a marble fountain created a landscape worthy of a postcard. Upon reaching the main door, it opened before she could knock. An older woman with a severe appearance, dressed in an impeccable housekeeper's uniform, greeted her with a scrutinizing look. "Miss Thompson, I presume," the woman said, her voice as rigid as her posture. "I'm Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper. Follow me, please." Lucy nodded, following Mrs. Peterson into the mansion. The foyer was impressive, with a polished marble floor that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier. Oil paintings of what appeared to be ancestors of the Parker family adorned the walls. "Mrs. Parker is waiting for you in the living room," Mrs. Peterson informed, guiding Lucy through a hallway adorned with antiques and works of art. Upon entering the living room, Lucy found herself face to face with Sophia Parker, an elegant woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a designer suit and wearing discreet but expensive jewelry. Next to her, sitting in a leather armchair, was a boy of about 5 years old, Matthew, the Parker's son, and the reason Lucy was there. "Welcome, Lucy," Sophia greeted with a cordial but distant smile. "I hope you're ready to start. Matthew needs constant attention and has a strict schedule that you'll need to follow to the letter." Lucy nodded, smiling at little Matthew, who was looking at her curiously from behind an illustrated book. "Of course, Mrs. Parker, I'm here to help in any way I can." "Good," Sophia replied, standing up. "Mrs. Peterson will show you to your room and explain your responsibilities." "Matthew, darling, say hello to Lucy. She'll be your new nanny." Matthew lowered the book slowly, revealing large brown eyes and a shy smile. "Hello, Lucy," he murmured. "Hello, Matthew," Lucy responded, crouching down to his level. "I'm very happy to meet you. What book are you reading?" Before Matthew could answer, a deep and authoritative voice resonated in the room. "Sophia, where are the documents I asked for?" Lucy turned to see a tall man with an imposing bearing enter the living room. He wore a tailored suit and his face showed a serious and distant expression. This must be Alexander Parker, Matthew's father and owner of the mansion. Alexander barely spared a glance at Lucy before fixing his attention on his wife. "I need those papers for this afternoon's meeting." "They're in your office, Alexander," Sophia replied, her tone subtly changing. "Lucy, this is my husband, Alexander." Parker Alexander finally deigned to look at Lucy, his cold eyes quickly assessing her. "Ah yes, the new nanny. I hope you're more competent than the previous one." Lucy felt as if she'd been doused with cold water. "Mr. Parker, I assure you I'll do everything possible to take good care of Matthew." Alexander made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "I should hope so. I don't have time to deal with incompetence." Without another word, he left the room, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Sophia let out an almost imperceptible sigh before regaining her composure. "Well, Lucy, as you can see, we're all very busy here. I trust you'll be able to adapt quickly." Lucy nodded, determined not to let Alexander's cold attitude discourage her. "Of course, Mrs. Parker, I'll do my best." As Mrs. Peterson led her out of the living room, Lucy took one last look at Matthew, who gave her a small smile. At that moment, Lucy knew that despite the challenges that might arise, she would do everything possible to care for this child and earn a place in this peculiar family. What Lucy couldn't imagine was that her arrival at Oakwood Estate would mark the beginning of a series of events that would forever change the lives of all the mansion's inhabitants, unearthing long-buried secrets and testing family ties in ways no one could have anticipated. The days at Oakwood Estate passed with an almost military routine. Lucy woke up before dawn, quickly got ready, and went down to the kitchen to help prepare Matthew's breakfast. Despite the initial cold reception, she soon found herself enjoying the little boy's company. Matthew was a sweet and intelligent child. Although he often seemed withdrawn and lonely, Lucy discovered she had a special gift for getting the boy to open up. And little by little, she began to see glimpses of a lively and curious personality that seemed to have been hidden under layers of shyness. One morning, as they were having breakfast on the terrace overlooking the garden, Matthew asked her a question that took her by surprise. "Lucy, why does Dad never play with me?" The question made Lucy's heart ache. In the weeks she had been at the mansion, she had rarely seen Alexander interact with his son beyond brief greetings or quick instructions. "Well, Matthew," Lucy began, carefully choosing her words, "your dad has a lot of work and responsibilities. I'm sure he'd like to spend more time with you, but sometimes adults have to do things they don't want to." Matthew nodded slowly, but Lucy could see the sadness in his eyes. "Do you think he'll ever want to play with me?" "I'm sure he will," Lucy replied, trying to sound optimistic. "In the meantime, what do you say we play with that new construction set your mum gave you?" Matthew's face lit up at the suggestion, and soon they were immersed in building an elaborate city of blocks. Lucy couldn't help but notice how the boy seemed to flourish with a little attention and affection. As the days passed, Lucy earned the trust not only of Matthew, but also of Sophia and the rest of the mansion's staff. Even Mrs. Peterson, initially distant and critical, began to show a kinder side towards the young nanny. However, Alexander remained an enigma. He was rarely home, and when he was, he seemed more interested in his work than in his family. Lucy often observed him from afar, intrigued by the contrast between his professional success and his apparent emotional coldness. One afternoon, as Lucy was helping Matthew with his homework in the mansion's library, she heard raised voices coming from Alexander's office. Curious, she quietly approached the half-open door. "You can't keep going on like this, Alexander!" It was Sophia's voice, laden with frustration. "Matthew needs you. I need you. When are you going to let the past be the past?" "It's not that simple, Sophia," Alexander replied, his voice tense. "There are things you don't understand, things I can't explain." "Then explain them to me," Sophia exclaimed. "We're a family, Alexander. We're supposed to trust each other." There was a long silence, and then Lucy heard footsteps approaching the door. Quickly, she retreated and pretended to be absorbed in Matthew's book when Sophia came out of the office, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That incident left Lucy thoughtful. What secrets was Alexander keeping? What dark past tormented this seemingly perfect family? Her reflections were interrupted by a sharp cry coming from the kitchen. Without thinking twice, Lucy ran towards the source of the sound, her heart pounding. Upon entering the kitchen, she encountered a terrifying scene. Matthew was standing, his face red and his hands clutching his throat. Mrs. Peterson was beside him, frantically patting his back. "He's choking!" Mrs. Peterson cried, panic evident in her voice. Lucy acted on instinct. Remembering her first aid training, she quickly approached Matthew, positioned him correctly, and began performing the Heimlich maneuver. After a few agonizing moments, a piece of apple shot out of Matthew's mouth, who immediately began coughing and breathing with difficulty. Lucy hugged the boy, whispering reassuring words while Mrs. Peterson frantically called Matthew's parents. Minutes later, Sophia burst into the kitchen, closely followed by Alexander. The expression of terror on their faces transformed into relief upon seeing Matthew breathing normally in Lucy's arms. "My baby!" Sophia exclaimed, rushing to embrace her son. "What happened?" As Mrs. Peterson explained the situation, Lucy noticed something she had never seen before, a crack in Alexander's cold facade. For a brief moment, she saw genuine fear and concern in his eyes as he looked at his son. "Thank you," Alexander suddenly said, addressing Lucy. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but laden with an emotion Lucy had never heard before. "Thank you for saving my son." Lucy nodded, surprised by this sudden change. "I just did what anyone would have done," she responded humbly. That night, as Lucy prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events. She had seen a different side of the Parker family, a glimpse of the vulnerability and love that hid beneath their cold facade. What Lucy didn't know was that this incident would mark a turning point in her relationship with the family, especially with Alexander. The walls that the Parker patriarch had built around himself were beginning to crack, and Lucy, unknowingly, was about to enter a world of secrets and dangers she could never have imagined. The weeks following the incident in the kitchen brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamics at Oakwood Estate. Lucy noticed that Alexander was spending more time at home, and although he was still distant, there were moments when she caught him looking at Matthew with a mixture of pride and what seemed like remorse. One afternoon, as Lucy was helping Matthew with a school project in the garden, Alexander approached them. To both their surprise, he sat down on the grass beside them. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice less harsh than usual. Matthew, initially surprised by his father's presence, soon began enthusiastically explaining his project about the solar system. Lucy watched with a mixture of amazement and joy as Alexander listened attentively, asking questions and offering suggestions. However, the peace of that moment was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Peterson, who announced that Alexander had an urgent call in his office. "I'm sorry, I have to take this," Alexander said, standing up for a moment. Lucy thought she saw a flash of frustration in his eyes before his expression hardened again. "Good work, Matthew. Keep it up." As Alexander walked away, Lucy noticed the look of disappointment in Matthew's eyes. "Hey," she said softly, "what do you say we finish this and then go for some ice cream?" The smile returned to the boy's face, but Lucy couldn't help feeling a pang of concern. What was so important that it constantly pulled Alexander away from his family? That night, as Lucy made her usual rounds to ensure everything was in order before going to bed, she heard voices coming from Alexander's office. Normally, she would have continued on her way, but something in the urgent and whispered tone of the voices made her stop. "You can't keep ignoring them, Alexander," she heard an unfamiliar voice say. "They're losing patience." "I already told them I'm out," Alexander responded, his voice tense. "I have a family now, a life they can't expect me to come back as if nothing had happened." "You know it's not that simple," the unknown voice insisted. "What you did, what we did, it's not something you can just walk away from." There was a long silence, and then Lucy heard footsteps approaching the door. Quickly, she hid behind a nearby column, her heart pounding. The office door opened and a man Lucy had never seen before came out. He was tall, with an intimidating appearance, with a scar crossing his left cheek. The man looked both ways down the hallway before quickly heading towards the exit. Lucy waited until the footsteps faded before coming out of her hiding place. Her mind was spinning. What did all this mean? What was Alexander involved in? The following days, Lucy couldn't get the conversation she had overheard out of her head. She observed Alexander with new eyes, looking for clues in his behavior that could give her some idea of what was going on. One afternoon, while organizing some books in the library, Lucy noticed something strange. One of the books on the highest shelf seemed to be out of place. As she tried to adjust it, the book fell, revealing a small secret compartment behind it. With her heart racing, Lucy looked around to make sure she was alone before examining the contents of the compartment. Inside was a yellow envelope, old and wrinkled. She knew she shouldn't, that she was invading the family's privacy, but curiosity got the better of her. With trembling hands, she opened. The envelope inside were old photos and newspaper clippings. The photos showed a younger Alexander, surrounded by dangerous-looking men. The headlines of the clippings spoke of daring robberies and sophisticated criminal operations. Lucy felt the ground move beneath her feet. Had Alexander been part of a criminal organization? Was this the dark past he was trying to escape? Before she could fully process what she was seeing, she heard footsteps approaching the library. Quickly, she stuffed everything back into the envelope and put it in its place, just in time before Sophia entered the room. "Ah, Lucy, here you are," Sophia said, her voice tense. "I need you to get Matthew ready. We have an important dinner tonight with some of Alexander's investors." Lucy nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "Of course, Mrs. Parker. I'll take care of it right away." As she followed Sophia out of the library, Lucy couldn't help but feel that she had just opened Pandora's box. The secrets of Oakwood Estate were darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and now she found herself at the center of it all. That night, during dinner with the investors, Lucy carefully observed the guests, wondering if any of them were connected to Alexander's turbulent past. Among the diners, one man in particular caught her attention. He was elegant and charismatic, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her. "This is Mr. Jack Sullivan," Alexander introduced. "Him an old friend and now a valuable investor in our projects." Lucy noticed how Alexander tensed his jaw when saying, "old friend." Could this man be part of his criminal past? As she served dessert, Lucy couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. "The old days, huh, Alexander?" Sullivan said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Who would have thought we'd end up like this, so respectable?" Alexander forced a smile. "Times change, Jack. We all grow up. Some more than others," Sullivan replied, his gaze fixed on Alexander. Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. There was a veiled threat in those words, and she was sure Alexander had noticed it too. That night, after the guests had left and the house had fallen silent, Lucy couldn't sleep. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image they formed was terrifying. Alexander Parker, the respectable businessman, the distant but loving father, was hiding a dark past, and that past, it seemed, refused to stay buried. As she looked out the window of her room towards the moonlit gardens, Lucy realized she was at a crossroads. Should she confront Alexander with what she knew? Should she tell Sophia? Or should she keep the secret and protect the family she had come to love? What Lucy didn't know was that her decision would set in motion a series of events that would forever change the fate of the Parkers. And her own, the past and the present, were about to collide, and she found herself right in the middle of the approaching storm. The days following the dinner with the investors were tense at Oakwood Estate. Lucy noticed that Alexander was more distracted than ever, often locked in his office for hours. And when he came out, he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sophia, for her part, alternated between moments of evident worry and others where she tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, especially in front of Matthew. The boy, sensitive as he was, seemed to perceive the tension in the air, becoming quieter and more withdrawn. One afternoon, as Lucy was helping Matthew with his homework in the garden, the boy asked her a question that took her by surprise. "Lucy, do you think Dad loves us?" The question made Lucy's heart ache. "Of course he does, Matthew. Your dad loves you and your mum very much." "Then why is he always so sad and angry?" Matthew insisted, his big brown eyes full of confusion and pain. Lucy took a deep breath, searching for the right words. Sometimes adults have problems that make them act strangely, but that doesn't mean they don't love us. Your dad is going through a difficult time, but I'm sure he loves you more than anything in the world. Matthew nodded slowly, but Lucy could see that her words hadn't completely dispelled his worries. At that moment, she promised herself she would do everything possible to protect this innocent child from the dark secrets that threatened to destroy his family. That night, as Lucy was doing her usual rounds before going to bed, she heard agitated voices coming from the master bedroom. She paused, debating whether to continue on her way or listen. Concern for the family won out over her sense of privacy. "You can't keep going on like this, Alexander." It was Sophia's voice, filled with frustration and fear. "I know something's going on. Why won't you trust me?" "It's complicated, Sophia," Alexander replied, his voice tense. "There are things from my past, things I've done, that it's better you don't know." "We're a family," Sophia exclaimed. "There shouldn't be secrets between us. What could be so terrible that you can't tell me?" There was a long silence, and then Lucy heard footsteps approaching the door. Quickly, she hid behind a nearby column. The door opened and Alexander came out, his face a mask of anguish. He headed to his office, closing the door with more force than necessary. Lucy waited a moment before coming out of her hiding place. Her mind was racing. The situation was getting worse, and she felt she had to do something. But what? The next day, as Lucy was cleaning Alexander's office, a task normally performed by Mrs. Peterson, but which she had delegated to her due to a cold, she noticed something strange. One of the desk drawers was slightly open, and inside she could see the edge of an envelope similar to the one she had found in the library. Nervously glancing at the door to make sure no one was coming, Lucy made an impulsive decision. She took the envelope out of the drawer and opened it. Inside were more photos and documents, but these were more recent than the ones she had seen before. There were photos of Alexander with Jack Sullivan and other suspicious-looking men. The documents appeared to be records of financial transactions, but the numbers were astronomical, and the company names didn't sound familiar to her. Suddenly, Lucy heard footsteps approaching. In panic, she tried to put everything back in the envelope, but in her haste, one of the photos fell to the floor, sliding under the desk. Just as Lucy was bending down to retrieve it, the door opened. Alexander entered, stopping short when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Lucy stood up slowly, her heart pounding. I was cleaning, Mr. Parker." Mrs. Peterson wasn't feeling well today. Alexander's eyes narrowed, fixing on the envelope Lucy was still holding in her hands. "What's that?" Lucy knew she was trapped. She could lie, but something in Alexander's gaze told her it would be useless. She took a deep breath and decided to face the situation head-on. "Mr. Parker, I know it's not my place, but I've seen things. I've heard things. I know you're in trouble, and I want to help." Alexander stared at her for what seemed like an eternity. Then, to Lucy's surprise, his shoulders slumped and he collapsed into his chair. "You have no idea what you're getting into, Lucy," he said, his voice tired. "There are things from my past, things I've done that I can't change. But you're trying to change now, aren't you?" Lucy asked softly. "For Matthew, for your family." Alexander nodded slowly. "I'm trying, but there are people who don't want to let me go. Dangerous people. Like Jack Sullivan," Lucy said, and saw how Alexander tensed at hearing the name. "Yes," he finally admitted. "Jack and we used to work together on things that weren't legal. I thought I had left all that behind when I met Sophia. But now they want you back," Lucy completed. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "You're more perceptive than I thought." "Mr. Parker," Lucy said, gathering all her courage, "I know it's not my place, but I think you should tell Mrs. Sophia all of this. She loves you, and together you could find a solution." Alexander shook his head. "I can't risk her or Matthew. If they knew the truth." "They're already suffering," Lucy interrupted gently. "Matthew thinks you don't love him. Mrs. Sophia is desperate to help you. The secrets are tearing them apart as much as any external danger." Alexander remained silent for a long moment, considering Lucy's words. Finally, he looked up, and Lucy saw a determination she hadn't seen before in his eyes. "You're right," he finally said. "I've been so busy trying to protect them that I didn't realize I was hurting them. I need to talk to Sophia." Lucy felt immense relief. "It's the right thing to do, Mr. Parker, and if I can help in any way..." Alexander looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You've already done more than you should have, Lucy. This could be dangerous. I don't want to involve you more than necessary." "I'm already involved," Lucy replied firmly. "I care about this family, about Matthew, about Mrs. Sophia, and about you too." Alexander nodded slowly. "Thank you, Lucy. You're a good person, better than we deserve." That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the conversation with Alexander over and over again. She knew she had done the right thing by pushing him to talk to Sophia, but she couldn't help feeling a knot in her stomach. What would happen now? How would Sophia react? And most importantly, what would they do about the threat posed by Jack Sullivan and his group? The next morning, the atmosphere at Oakwood Estate was different, Lucy could feel. At the moment she went down to the kitchen, Mrs. Peterson looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "The master and mistress have been locked in the office all night," the housekeeper murmured. "Something big is happening, Lucy." And I have a feeling you know more than you're letting on. Lucy merely shrugged, focusing on preparing Matthew's breakfast. She wasn't going to betray Alexander's trust, not even to Mrs. Peterson. Shortly after, Sophia entered the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she looked exhausted, but there was a determination in her gaze that Lucy hadn't seen before. "Lucy, could you come to the office for a moment?" Sophia asked. "Alexander and I need to talk to you." With her heart pounding, Lucy followed. Sophia to the office. Alexander was sitting behind his desk, looking as if he had aged 10 years in one night. But when he saw Lucy enter, he tried to muster a smile. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Sophia and I have been talking all night. I've told her everything about my past, about Jack and the others, everything." Sophia took her husband's hand. "It's been difficult to process, but I understand why he did it, why he kept it from us for so long. And now," Alexander continued, "we need your help, Lucy." Lucy looked at them in surprise. "My help? How can I help?" "You're intelligent and observant," Sophia said, "and most importantly, Matthew trusts you. We need you to help us keep him safe while we sort this out." "Jack and his group aren't going to give up easily," Alexander explained. "They're going to try to pressure me, maybe even through my family. We need to be prepared." Lucy nodded slowly, processing the information. "What exactly do they want? Why now after so long?" Alexander sighed heavily. "They have a big job in the works, something that could make them incredibly rich but also incredibly powerful. They need my help to pull it off." "And if you refuse?" Lucy asked, although she feared she knew the answer. "Then they'll threaten to expose my past," Alexander replied. "They would destroy everything I've built, my reputation, my company, and worst of all, it would put Sophia and Matthew in danger." Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. The situation was even worse than she had imagined. "What can we do?" she asked, determined to help in any way possible. "We have a plan," Sophia said, "but it's risky and we'll need your help to make it work." Over the next hour, Alexander and Sophia explained their plan to Lucy. It was bold and dangerous, but if it worked, it could free Alexander from his past once and for all. The plan involved setting a trap for Jack and his group. Gathering evidence of their current illegal activities, Alexander would pretend to cooperate with them, while secretly working with an old contact in the police to build a solid case against the organization. "Your role, Lucy," Alexander explained, "will be to keep up appearances. We need Matthew to be safe and unaware of all this, and we also need you to be our eyes and ears. If you notice anything suspicious, anything out of the ordinary, you must inform us immediately." Lucy nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "I'll do it, you can count on me." "Thank you, Lucy," Sophia said, taking her hand. "You don't know how much this means to us." As she left the office, Lucy realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer just Matthew's nanny. She was now a key piece in a dangerous game of deception and secrets. The following days were a mix of tension and forced normalcy. Lucy strived to maintain a normal routine for Matthew. While keeping a watchful eye for any sign of danger, Alexander spent more time away from home, supposedly in business meetings, but Lucy knew he was working on the plan. Sophia, for her part, maintained a facade of calm, but Lucy could see the fear in her eyes every time Alexander walked out the door. One afternoon, as Lucy and Matthew were playing in the garden, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A man with dark sunglasses was sitting at the wheel. Apparently observing the house, Lucy felt her blood run cold. Casually, she brought Matthew inside, making sure to close all doors and windows. Then, she sent a coded text message to Alexander, as they had agreed. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Lucy met secretly with Alexander and Sophia. "Good work, Lucy," Alexander said. "It was one of Jack's men. They're increasing the pressure." "What do we do now?" Lucy asked, the concern evident in her voice. "We stick to the plan," Alexander replied with determination. "We're close. We just need a little more time." As Lucy headed to her room that night, she couldn't help but feel they were walking on a knife's edge. One misstep and everything would come crashing down. but she also knew there was no turning back. They were all in. This together, united by the bonds of affection and loyalty that had formed over the past few months. What Lucy didn't know was that the real danger was yet to come. The forces that had been set in motion were about to collide, and she would find herself at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything she loved. The days turned into weeks, and the tension at Oakwood Estate grew with each passing hour. Lucy found herself in a constant state of alertness, dividing her attention between caring for Matthew and watching for any signs of danger. Alexander spent increasingly more time away from home, supposedly working on important projects. Lucy knew he was risking everything to gather evidence against Jack and his organization, but that didn't make the long absences any easier to bear, especially for Matthew. One night, as Lucy was tucking Matthew into bed, the boy looked at her with eyes full of worry. "Lucy, why doesn't Dad play with me anymore?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Doesn't he love me anymore?" Lucy's heart broke hearing those words. She sat on the edge of the bed and hugged the boy tightly. "Oh, Matthew, your dad loves you more than anything in the world," she assured him. "He's working very hard right now, but everything he does is for you and your mum. Soon everything will be back to normal, I promise." As Matthew fell asleep in her arms, Lucy wondered if she was doing the right thing by keeping the boy in the dark. Didn't he deserve to know the truth about what was happening? But then she remembered the determination in Alexander and Sophia's eyes. No, she decided, Matthew's ignorance was his best protection for now. The next day, Lucy was helping Mrs. Peterson prepare dinner when she heard the sound of a car arriving at the entrance. She looked out the window and saw Alexander getting out of his car, accompanied by Jack Sullivan. "Mrs. Peterson," Lucy said, trying to stay calm, "could you finish up here? I think Mr. Parker will need help with his guests." The housekeeper nodded, giving Lucy a curious look. "Of course, dear, go ahead." Lucy hurried to the main entrance, arriving just as Alexander and Jack were entering. The tension between the two men was palpable. "Ah, Lucy," Alexander said, his voice tense but controlled. "Please prepare something to drink for my guest and me in the office." "Right away, Mr. Parker," Lucy replied, noticing the evaluating look Jack was giving her. As she prepared the drinks, Lucy couldn't help but feel a chill. There was something about Jack Sullivan that made her nervous. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was a coldness in his gaze that spoke of danger. When she brought the drinks to the office, she could hear fragments of the conversation. "You can't keep putting it off, Alexander," Jack was saying, his voice soft but threatening. "We need an answer soon." "I told you I'm working on it," Alexander replied. "These things take time." Lucy entered, placing the drinks on the desk. She noticed how the conversation stopped abruptly and how Jack looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Thank you, Lucy," Alexander said. "That will be all." As she left the office, Lucy felt Jack's gaze fixed on her, back. She knew she had to inform Sophia immediately. She found Mrs. Parker in the library, pretending to read a book but clearly worried. "Mrs. Sophia," Lucy whispered, closing the door behind her. "Mr. Sullivan is here." Sophia visibly paled. "What? Why didn't Alexander tell me?" "I don't know," Lucy replied, but he seemed tense. "They're in the office now." Sophia stood up, her face a mask of determination. "Thank you, Lucy, please. Make sure Matthew doesn't come downstairs. I don't want him to see that man." Lucy nodded and quickly went up to Matthew's room. The boy was absorbed in his games, oblivious to the drama unfolding under his roof. The hours passed slowly. Lucy kept Matthew occupied with games and stories, while keeping an ear out for any unusual sounds coming from downstairs. Finally, she heard the sound of the front door closing. She looked out the window and saw Jack Sullivan's car driving away. "Matthew, honey," Lucy said, "what do you say we go look for a snack in the kitchen?" As they went down the stairs, Lucy saw Alexander and Sophia coming out of the office. Both looked exhausted and worried. "Dad!" Matthew exclaimed, running towards Alexander. Alexander hugged his son tightly, as if he were a lifeline in the middle of a storm. "Hey champ, how was your day?" As Matthew enthusiastically recounted his games, Lucy exchanged a significant look with Sophia. Mrs. Parker nodded slightly, indicating they would talk later. That night, after Matthew had gone to bed, Lucy met with Alexander and Sophia in the office. "Things are getting complicated," Alexander said. Without preamble, "Jack is losing patience. He wants me to participate in a major operation next week." "What kind of operation?" Lucy asked, fearing the answer. "A robbery," Alexander replied, his voice laden with disgust. "On a large scale. If it goes well, it will be the biggest job they've ever pulled off." "And if you refuse?" Sophia asked, although her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Alexander closed his eyes, his face a mask of anguish. "Then they'll expose everything, my past, my connections to them. Everything we've worked for would come crashing down." Lucy felt her blood run cold. The situation was even worse than she had imagined. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander exchanged a look with Sophia before responding, "I'm going to participate." "No," Lucy exclaimed, surprised by her own vehemence. "You can't do that. It's too dangerous." "I have no choice," Alexander replied firmly. "But I'm not going to do it to help them. This is our chance to catch them." Sophia took her husband's hand. "Alexander has been in contact with a police detective, an old trusted friend. They're going to prepare an undercover operation. The idea," Alexander continued, "is for me to participate in the planning of the robbery, providing vital information to the police in the process. When the time comes for the operation, the police will be ready to catch Jack and his entire organization red-handed." Lucy listened with a mixture of amazement and terror. It was a bold plan, but incredibly dangerous. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked. "What if Jack suspects?" "It's a risk we have to take," Alexander replied. "It's our only chance to free ourselves from them once and for all." Lucy nodded slowly, processing. "The information? How can I help?" "We need you to keep doing what you've been doing," Sophia said. "Keep Matthew safe and unaware of all this, and keep being our eyes and ears. If you notice anything suspicious, anything at all, we need to know immediately." "I'll do it," Lucy promised. "You can count on me." The following days were an agony of waiting and tension. Alexander spent more and more time away from home, supposedly in business, meetings, but Lucy knew he was working on the plan with Jack and his group. Sophia did her best to maintain normalcy in the house, but Lucy could see the fear and worry in her eyes every time Alexander walked out the door. Matthew, for his part, became increasingly withdrawn and quiet. Lucy did everything she could to cheer him up, inventing new games and taking him for walks in the gardens, but nothing seemed to completely dispel the cloud of sadness that had settled over the boy. One afternoon, as Lucy was helping Matthew with his homework, the boy surprised her with a question. "Lucy, do dads sometimes leave and never come back?" Lucy felt her heart constrict. "Why do you ask that, Matthew?" The boy lowered his gaze nervously, playing with his pencil. "It's just that Dad is almost never home now, and when he is, he always seems sad and angry. What if he decides to leave and not come back?" Lucy hugged the boy tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to escape her eyes. "Oh, Matthew, your dad loves you more than anything in the world. He would never, ever leave you. He's going through a tough time right now, but I promise you everything will get better soon." As she comforted Matthew, Lucy realized how much was at stake. It wasn't just the family's safety or Alexander's reputation. It was the happiness and future of this innocent child she cared for so much. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Lucy went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She was surprised to find Alexander sitting in the dark, his head in his hands. "Mr. Parker," she called softly. "Is everything all right?" Alexander looked up, and Lucy could see the exhaustion and desperation in his eyes. "No, Lucy, nothing is all right." Lucy sat across from him, waiting silently for him to continue. "Tomorrow is the day," Alexander finally said. "The big heist. If everything goes according to plan, by this time tomorrow, Jack and his entire organization will be behind bars." "That's good, isn't it?" Lucy asked. Although she could sense there was more, Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "It should be, But I'm afraid, Lucy. Afraid that something will go wrong. Afraid that Jack will suspect. Afraid that I won't see my family again." Lucy felt a wave of compassion for this man who had gone from being a distant boss to someone she cared deeply about. "Mr. Parker," she said firmly, "you are brave and intelligent. You've planned everything carefully, and most importantly, you're doing this for the right reasons. For your family, for Matthew." Alexander looked at her, surprised by the vehemence in her voice. "Matthew asked me today if dads sometimes leave and don't come back," Lucy continued. "I promised him you would always come back. Don't make me break that promise." Something changed in Alexander's expression. The desperation gave way to iron determination. "You're right, Lucy. I can't give up now. Not when there's so much at stake." He stood up, seeming stronger and more determined than Lucy had seen him in weeks. "Thank you," he said simply, but Lucy could feel the weight of gratitude in that single word. As Alexander left the kitchen, Lucy remained seated, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. Tomorrow would be the day that would change everything. For better or worse, the fate of the Parker family would be decided in the next 24 hours. What Lucy didn't know was that fate had a few more surprises in store. The upcoming operation would not only put Alexander in danger, but would also drag her into the center of a danger she could never have imagined. The dawn of the decisive day arrived with a deceptive calm. Lucy woke up before sunrise, her mind already racing with anxiety about what was to come. She dressed mechanically and went down to the kitchen, surprised to find Sophia already there, preparing coffee with trembling hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker," Lucy greeted softly. Sophia turned, and Lucy could see the dark circles under her eyes, testament to a sleepless night. "Good morning, Lucy," she replied with a forced smile. "Coffee?" Lucy nodded, accepting the cup Sophia offered her. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "Alexander already left," Sophia finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "He left before dawn. He said it was better that way." Lucy reached for Sophia's hand, squeezing it gently. "Everything will be all right," she said, wishing she could believe her own words. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Lucy strived to maintain a facade of normalcy for Matthew, but the boy seemed to sense that something wasn't right. He was quieter than usual, sticking to Lucy, as if he feared she might disappear too. In the mid-afternoon, while Lucy was helping Matthew with a puzzle in the living room, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of the house. A chill ran down her spine when she saw two grim-looking men get out of the vehicle and head towards the entrance. "Matthew, sweetie," she said, keeping her voice calm, "why don't you go up to your room and finish the drawing you started this morning? I'll come see you in a moment." The boy had barely gone up the stairs when the doorbell rang. Lucy exchanged an alarmed look with Sophia, who had appeared in the living room doorway. "I'll answer it," Sophia said with a firmness that surprised Lucy. From her position, Lucy could hear the conversation at the entrance. "Mrs. Parker," said a deep and threatening voice, "we need to talk to your husband, it's urgent." "My husband isn't home," Sophia replied coldly. "And you're not welcome here. I suggest you leave before I call the police." There was a moment of tense silence, and then Lucy heard the sound of forced footsteps. The men had entered by force. "I'm afraid you don't understand the situation, Mrs. Parker," said the same voice. "Your husband owes us something, and we're going to collect one way or another." Lucy felt her blood run cold. Without thinking twice, she took out her phone and sent an urgent text message to the number Alexander had given her for emergencies. Then, mustering her courage, she went out to the hallway. The two men, large and threatening, had Sophia cornered against the wall. "Mrs. Parker," Lucy called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Matthew needs you upstairs. I'll take care of our guests." Sophia looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, understanding Lucy's strategy. With an almost imperceptible nod, she quickly went up the stairs. Lucy faced the intruders, her heart pounding but determined to protect the family. "Gentlemen," she said with a calmness she didn't feel, "as you can see, Mr. Parker isn't here. I suggest you leave, now. The police are already on their way." The larger of the two men approached Lucy, his face a mask of contained fury. "And who are you to give us orders, little girl?" Lucy raised her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm someone who has nothing to lose, and I assure you, if you harm this family, you'll regret it." For a moment, it seemed like the man was going to hit her. Lucy closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But then, the sound of sirens in the distance made the intruders pause. "This isn't over," the man growled, before both of them hurriedly left the house. Lucy slumped against the wall, shaking with relief and adrenaline, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down yet. Quickly, she locked the front door and activated the security system. She ran up the stairs, finding Sophia and Matthew hugging in the boys' room. "Are you okay?" she asked, breathless. Sophia nodded, hugging Matthew tighter. "Thanks to you, Lucy. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Lucy joined the hug, feeling the trembling in Matthew's small body. "Everything's okay now," she murmured, though she knew they were far from being out of danger. The following hours were an agony of waiting. The police arrived and took statements, but Lucy and Sophia were careful not to reveal too much following Alexander's instructions. When night finally fell, Matthew had fallen asleep. Exhausted by the stress and fear, Lucy and Sophia sat in the living room, jumping at every sound, waiting for news from Alexander. It was past midnight when the phone finally rang. Sophia picked it up with trembling hands, putting it on speaker. "Alexander." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Sophia, my love." Alexander's voice sounded tired, but triumphant. "It's done. We got them, all of them." Lucy and Sophia exchanged looks of relief and joy. "Are you all right?" Sophia asked, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I'm fine," Alexander replied. "Tired, but fine. I'll be home soon. There's a lot of paperwork to do, but Detective Johnson has assured me I can do it tomorrow. Right now, I just want to come home to you." "We're waiting for you," Sophia said, her voice full of love and relief after. Hanging up, Sophia turned to Lucy, her eyes bright with tears and gratitude. "Lucy, I don't know how to thank you. What you did today facing those men was incredibly brave." Lucy felt herself blushing. "I just did what anyone would have done. This family, you mean a lot to me." Sophia hugged her tightly. "You're more than an employee, Lucy. You're part of this family." Half an hour later, they heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Sophia ran to the door, Lucy following close behind. Alexander had barely set foot in the house. When Sophia threw herself into his arms, Lucy observed the emotional reunion, feeling a mixture of joy and a strange feeling of not belonging. She was about to discreetly withdraw when Alexander called her Lucy, he said, extending an arm towards her. "Come here, you're part of this too." With tears in her eyes, Lucy joined the family hug. For a moment, all the fears and dangers of the past few weeks seemed to vanish. Later that night, after Matthew woke up and had his own emotional reunion with his father, the family and Lucy gathered in the living room. Alexander, though visibly exhausted, began to recount what had happened. "The plan worked perfectly," he explained. "Jack and his group fell right into the trap. The police caught them red-handed, with enough evidence to lock them up for a long time." "And what will happen to you?" Lucy asked, expressing the concern they all had. Alexander smiled tiredly. "Detective Johnson has been very understanding. In view of my cooperation and the risk I took, they've offered me immunity. I'll have to testify, of course, but I won't face charges." Sophia let out a sigh of relief. "So it's over? Is it really over?" "Yes, my love," Alexander replied, taking her hand. "It's over. We can start over without secrets, without fears." Lucy felt a wave of happiness for the family, but also a pang of sadness. Now that everything was over, what would her place be? As if reading her thoughts, Alexander turned to her. "Lucy, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, not just for taking care of Matthew, but for protecting our family, for risking your own safety." "You don't have to thank me," Lucy began, but Alexander gently interrupted her. "Yes, we do, and we want to do more than just thank you." He exchanged a look with Sophia, who nodded with a smile. "Lucy, we'd like you to stay with us, not just as Matthew's nanny, but as part of our family." Lucy felt her breath catch. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Matthew chimed in, his eyes bright with hope. Please, Lucy, stay with us." With tears in her eyes, Lucy nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll stay." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alexander spent long hours with the police and prosecutors, providing all the information he had about Jack's organization. Sophia was busy handling the press, which was naturally in a frenzy over the fall of one of the city's most notorious criminal organizations. Lucy, for her part, focused on keeping Matthew occupied and happy, protecting him as best she could from the chaos surrounding the family. But now, her role went beyond being just the nanny. She was a confidant for Sophia, a support for Alexander, and increasingly, a second mother to Matthew. One afternoon, as Lucy and Matthew were playing in the garden, the boy asked a question that took her by surprise. "Lucy," he said, his voice serious, "now that you're part of the family, does that mean you're like my big sister?" Lucy felt a lump form in her throat. "Well, Matthew," she answered carefully, "I am part of the family, yes, but in a special way I'm like an extra guardian for you, someone who will always be there to take care of you and love you, along with your parents." Matthew seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "I like that," he finally said, hugging Lucy. "I love you, Lucy." "I love you too, Matthew," Lucy replied, hugging him tightly. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Lucy joined Alexander and Sophia in the study. They had developed the habit of meeting there every night, sharing the day's events and planning for the future. "The trial will start next week," Alexander announced. "The prosecutor says they have a solid case. With my testimony, it's almost certain that Jack and the others will spend the rest of their lives in prison." "How do you feel about it?" Lucy asked. Noticing the mix of emotions on Alexander's face, Alexander sighed deeply. "It's complicated. On one hand, I feel relief that all of this is finally coming to an end. On the other, I can't help but feel some guilt. After all, there was a time when I considered Jack a friend." Sophia took her husband's hand. "You did the right thing, Alexander. You chose your family. You chose to do what's right." "Sophia's right," Lucy added. "You made a difficult decision, but it was the right one. You're protecting not just your family, but many other people who could have been victims of Jack and his organization." Alexander smiled at both of them, the gratitude evident in his eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you two," he said softly. "Thank you for standing by me through all of this." "Always," Sophia replied, leaning in to kiss her husband. Lucy smiled, feeling truly part of this family she had come to love. However, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Despite Alexander's assurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jack Sullivan wasn't the type of man who would give up easily. What Lucy didn't know was that her instincts were correct. As the Parker family began to rebuild their life, dark forces were moving in the shadows, planning a revenge that would test family ties in a way none of them could have imagined. The weeks passed, and gradually, life at Oakwood Estate began to find a new rhythm. The trial against Jack Sullivan and his organization was in full swing, with Alexander spending long days in court, testifying and facing his past. Lucy had adapted to her new role in the family with an ease that surprised her. She was no longer just Matthew's nanny, but a support figure for the entire family. She helped Sophia manage the house and social. Commitments accompanied Alexander in his moments of doubt before testifying, and continued to be Matthew's pillar, who seemed to flourish under the additional love and attention. One sunny afternoon, as Lucy and Matthew were walking in the nearby park, the boy made an observation that took her by surprise. "Lucy," he said, his voice serious despite his young age, "Dad smiles more now, and Mum doesn't seem sad all the time anymore." Lucy felt a wave of affection for the perceptive child. "You're right, Matthew. Your parents have been through tough times, but now things are getting better." "Is it because of you?" Matthew asked, his big brown eyes fixed on her. "Is it because you stayed with us?" Lucy crouched down to be at the boy's level, moved by his question. "Oh, Matthew, things have improved for many reasons. Your parents are very strong and brave, and you, my little one, are a constant source of joy for all of us. If I've been able to help in any way, I'm happy about that." Matthew hugged her tightly. "I'm glad you stayed. Lucy, I love you." "I love you too, Matthew," Lucy replied, feeling her heart swell with love for this boy who had become such an important part of her life. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, Lucy joined Alexander and Sophia in the study, as had become their custom. Alexander looked particularly tired, the lines of stress evident on his face. "How was it today?" Sophia asked softly, serving her husband a cup of tea. Alexander sighed deeply. "Difficult Jack's lawyer tried to discredit me, insinuating that I was as guilty as he was, but the prosecutor did a good job defending my cooperation and the risk I took." "You're doing very well, Alexander," Lucy said, offering a supportive smile. "You're doing the right thing." Alexander gave her a tired smile. "Thank you, Lucy. I don't know what we'd do without you. You've been a blessing to this family." Sophia nodded in agreement. "It's true, Lucy. We can never thank you enough for everything you've done for us." Lucy felt herself blushing at the praise. "You don't have to thank me, this family. You mean everything to me." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Alexander's phone. He frowned at, seeing the number, but answered anyway. "Detective Johnson." "Yes, I'm listening." Alexander's expression changed from confusion to concern as he listened. "I understand. Yes, of course. We'll take additional precautions. Thank you for letting me know." When he hung up, both Sophia and Lucy were looking at him expectantly. "That was Detective Johnson," Alexander explained, his voice tense. "They've intercepted some worrying communications. It seems that some of Jack's associates who are still free might be planning something." "Something like what?" Sophia asked, fear evident in her voice. "They're not sure," Alexander replied, "but the detective believes they might try to intimidate us into me changing my testimony or dropping the charges." Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. Just when they thought everything was over, danger was lurking again. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her mind already working on ways to protect Matthew. Alexander ran a hand through his hair. A gesture Lucy had learned meant he was deeply worried. "Detective Johnson suggests we increase security. They're going to assign a couple of officers to watch the house, and they recommend we be extra careful, especially when we go out." Sophia moved closer to her husband, taking his hand. "We'll get through this, Alexander." Together, Lucy nodded in agreement. "I'm with you. I'll do everything I can to help keep the family safe." Alexander smiled at both of them, the gratitude evident in his tired eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you two. Thank you for standing by me through all of this." The following days passed in a state of constant alertness. Lucy was especially vigilant with Matthew, making sure he was never alone and always within sight of a trusted adult. Sophia took charge of reinforcing the house's security, installing new alarms and cameras. Alexander, for his part, continued with his testimony in the trial, determined to see justice done despite the threats. One afternoon, as Lucy was helping Matthew with his homework in the garden, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A man with dark sunglasses was sitting at the wheel, apparently observing the house. Feeling her blood run cold, Lucy acted calmly so as not to alarm Matthew. "Honey, what do you say we finish this inside? I think it's starting to get cold out here." Matthew nodded absent-mindedly, absorbed in his coloring task. Lucy guided him towards the house, casting one last glance at the suspicious car before closing the door. As soon as Matthew was safely in his room, Lucy hurried to inform Alexander and Sophia about the suspicious car. "Are you sure it wasn't one of the police officers assigned to our protection?" Alexander asked, his face tense with worry. Lucy shook her head. "No, I know the officers' cars. This was different, and the man there was something about him that gave me the creeps." Sophia approached the window, taking a careful look through the curtains. "The car is gone now," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm going to call Detective Johnson," Alexander decided. Taking out his phone, "We need to reinforce security." As Alexander spoke with the detective, Lucy and Sophia looked at each other, sharing a silent promise to do everything possible to protect their family. The following days were a mixture of tension and apparent normalcy. The police increased their presence around Oakwood Estate, and Alexander hired additional private security. Lucy remained in a constant state of alert, her eyes always searching for any sign of danger. One night, as Lucy was tucking Matthew in for bed, the boy surprised her with a question. "Lucy, why are there so many police officers around our house?" Lucy felt her heart constrict. Despite their best efforts, Matthew had noticed the changes. "Well, Matthew," she began, carefully choosing her words, "sometimes when adults do very important things, like what your dad is doing in court, they need a little extra help to stay safe." Matthew looked at her with his big brown eyes full of concern. "Are we in danger?" Lucy hugged the boy tightly. "No, sweetheart, we're safe. We're all here to protect you. Your dad, your mum, me, and all those police officers. You have nothing to worry about." Although her words reassured Matthew, Lucy couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for not being completely honest with him, but she reminded herself that protecting Matthew's innocence was one of her main responsibilities. The next day, the trial reached its final phase. Alexander gave his final testimony, coming face to face with Jack Sullivan in the courtroom. Lucy and Sophia waited anxiously at home, keeping an eye on the phone. When Alexander's call finally came, they both held their breath. "It's over," Alexander said, his voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "The jury has delivered their verdict. Jack and all the others have been found guilty. They're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison." Sophia let out a sob of relief, hugging Lucy. "Thank God," she murmured. "It's finally over." But Lucy couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something inside her told her this wasn't the end, but perhaps the beginning of something even more dangerous. Her fears were confirmed that very night. Alexander had returned home, and the family was celebrating the end of the trial with a special dinner. Matthew was already in bed, and the three adults were in the dining room, enjoying a moment of peace after weeks of tension. Suddenly, all the lights in the house went out. "What's happening?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling in the darkness. Before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of breaking glass somewhere in the house. "Someone's broken in!" Alexander exclaimed. "Quick, to the panic room!" Lucy felt fear invade her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Matthew!" she cried. "We have to get Matthew!" Without waiting for a response, Lucy rushed towards the stairs in the darkness, her heart pounding. She could hear heavy footsteps on the ground floor, male voices shouting orders. She reached Matthew's room just as the door was opening. The boy was standing next to his bed, his eyes large and frightened in the dim light. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice trembling, "what's happening?" "Shh, sweetie," Lucy replied, taking him in her arms. "Everything's going to be all right. We're going to play a game, okay? We're going to be very, very quiet, and we're going to hide." Lucy carried Matthew to the closet, closing the door behind them just as she heard footsteps in the hallway. They huddled at the back of the closet, Lucy holding Matthew tightly, whispering words of comfort in his ear. The footsteps approached the room. Lucy held her breath, silently praying for a miracle. Suddenly, she heard shouts and the sound of a fight in the hallway. "Police! Everyone on the ground!" Lucy felt a wave of relief. Help had arrived, but her relief was short-lived when she heard a gunshot, followed by more shouts and the sound of bodies falling. "Lucy! Matthew!" It was Alexander's voice, laden with panic. "Here!" Lucy shouted, coming out of the closet with Matthew still in her arms. "We're here!" Alexander ran into the room, closely followed by Sophia and several police officers. In seconds, Matthew was in his parents' arms, the three of them hugging tightly. Lucy observed the scene with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had been so close to disaster, but somehow they had survived. As the police led the handcuffed intruders away, Detective Johnson approached the family. "They were the last free members of Sullivan's organization," he explained. "They attempted one last desperate strike, but we had them under surveillance. You were never really in danger." Alexander nodded, thanking the detective. Then he turned to Lucy, extending an arm to include her in the family hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "for protecting Matthew, for being with us through all of this. I don't know what we would have done without you." Lucy felt tears running down her cheeks as she joined the hug. Finally, after months of fear and uncertainty, it seemed that it was really over. The family was safe, united and stronger than ever. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, bathing the room in a soft golden light, Lucy knew that, whatever happened, this was her family now, and she would do anything to protect them. The days following the attempted attack were a whirlwind of activity. Police came and went, taking statements and reinforcing security. Reporters camped out in front of Oakwood Estate, eager to get the exclusive on the dramatic end of the Sullivan case. But inside the house, the Parker family and Lucy clung to the calm they had found in the midst of the storm. One morning, as Lucy was preparing breakfast, she felt a pair of small arms wrap around her waist. She turned to find Matthew, his eyes still sleepy but full of affection. "Good morning, little one." Lucy smiled, crouching down to his level. "Did you sleep well?" Matthew nodded, but there was a seriousness in his face that made Lucy worry. "Lucy," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper, "are the bad men going to come back?" Lucy felt her heart constrict. Despite their best efforts, Matthew had witnessed more than a child his age should have. She took a moment to carefully consider her response. "No, sweetie," she finally said, looking directly into the boy's eyes. "The bad men aren't coming back. Your dad, the police, and many brave people have made sure they can't hurt us ever again." Matthew seemed to process this information, his little brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you promise?" "I promise," Lucy replied, hugging the boy tightly. "And you know I always keep my promises, right?" Matthew nodded against her shoulder, and Lucy felt the tension leave his small body. At that moment, she vowed to herself that she would do everything possible to help Matthew regain the carefree joy typical of his age. Later that day, Alexander gathered the whole family, including Lucy, in the living room. His face showed signs of fatigue, but there was a new determination in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at each of them, "and I believe we need a change. A fresh start." Sophia took her husband's hand, encouraging him to continue. "I propose we take a long vacation," Alexander continued. "Away from here, away from all this, a place where we can heal as a family and rediscover ourselves." Lucy felt a pang of sadness. Of course, the family needed time alone to recover. She understood that she wasn't part of that "we." She began to stand up, thinking it was better to leave them alone to discuss their plans. "Where are you going, Lucy?" Alexander asked, surprised. I thought you'd want privacy to discuss your family plans," Lucy replied, hesitantly. Sophia and Alexander exchanged a look before Sophia spoke. "Lucy, when Alexander says family, he includes you. We can't imagine doing this without you." Lucy felt a lump form in her throat. "But I'm not really part of the family, You're much more than a nanny," Alexander interrupted firmly. "You're the one who kept this family together in the darkest moments, who protected our son when we needed it most. You're part of this family, Lucy. If you want to be—" Matthew, who had been listening silently, suddenly jumped from his seat and ran to hug Lucy. "Please say yes," he pleaded. "I don't want to go anywhere without you." Lucy looked at the expectant faces around her, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt truly part of something, truly loved and valued. "Yes," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "Yes, I'd love to be part of this family." Matthew's face lit up with a radiant smile, and soon Lucy found herself wrapped in a group hug, tears and laughter mixing in a catharsis of emotions. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. They decided to spend a month in a secluded beach house, away from the bustle of the city and the memories of difficult times. Lucy helped with the packing, making sure Matthew had all his favorite toys and books. On the day of departure, as they were loading the car, Lucy couldn't help but look back at Oakwood Estate. The mansion, which had once seemed cold and intimidating to her, was now full of memories, both good and bad. But as she watched Matthew excitedly running around the car, Sophia laughing at something Alexander had said, she knew that home wasn't a place, but the people you were with. The trip to the beach was long, but filled with laughter and songs. Matthew insisted on sitting next to Lucy in the back seat, and they spent hours playing games and telling stories when they finally reached their destination. The sun was setting, painting the sky in golden and pink hues. The beach house was beautiful, with large windows overlooking the ocean and a perfect terrace for outdoor dinners. But the most impressive thing was the sense of peace that seemed to permeate the place that night. After Matthew had fallen asleep, exhausted from the excitement of the trip, the three adults sat on the terrace, gazing at the stars and listening to the soft rumble of the waves. "You know," Alexander said, breaking the comfortable silence, "a year ago I never would have imagined we'd be here, like this." Sophia took his hand, smiling softly. "Life has a curious way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Lucy nodded, thoughtful. "When I first arrived at Oakwood Estate, I was so nervous I never thought I'd find a family. And we never thought we'd find someone who would become such an integral part of our lives," Alexander completed, smiling warmly at Lucy. "It's funny how the most difficult circumstances can bring the most unexpected gifts." Sophia nodded, her eyes shining with contained emotion. "We've been through so much, but look at us now. We're here together, stronger than ever." The days at the beach passed in a blur of sun, sand, and laughter. Matthew flourished under the constant attention and relaxed environment. Lucy watched with joy as he built elaborate sandcastles, splashed in the waves, and chased seagulls along the shore. One afternoon, while Matthew was taking a nap, Lucy found herself walking on the beach with Alexander. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, until Alexander spoke. "You know, Lucy," he began, his voice soft but serious, "I've never properly thanked you for everything you've done for us." Lucy felt herself blushing. "It's not necessary, really. You've given me so much." Alexander shook his head. "No, it is necessary. When you came into our lives, I was a mess. I was so consumed by guilt from my past, so desperate to protect my family, that I was pushing them away, but you kept us together. You gave Matthew the love and attention I couldn't give him at that time. You supported Sophia when I wasn't there, and you helped me find the courage to do the right thing." Lucy felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Alexander, let me finish," he said gently. "What I want to say is thank you. Thank you for being the strength our family needed. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when things got dangerous. And thank you for accepting us as your family." Lucy could no longer hold back the tears. Alexander hugged her, and for a moment, they stood like that, the sound of the waves and the cry of the seagulls as the only soundtrack when they separated. Alexander had a mischievous smile on his face. "Now what, do you say we go wake up that little sleepyhead and teach him how to surf?" Lucy laughed, wiping away her tears. "Sounds perfect to me." The days turned into weeks, and before they knew it, it was time to go home. But as they packed their things, Lucy realized that something had changed. She no longer thought of Oakwood Estate as the place where she worked, but as her home. The return trip was full of excited plans for the future. Matthew couldn't stop talking about how he wanted to redecorate his room with beach themes. Sophia discussed ideas for a welcome back party for their closest friends. And Alexander talked about a new beginning, about using his resources and connections to do something good, to make a difference. When they finally arrived at Oakwood Estate, Lucy was surprised to see how different everything looked. The mansion, which had once seemed cold and intimidating to her, now stood welcoming and familiar. "Welcome home," Mrs. Peterson said, greeting them at the door with a warm smile. And as they crossed the threshold, Lucy knew it was true. She was home. The following months brought many positive changes. Alexander, true to his word, began using his connections and resources to establish a foundation that helped at-risk youth, offering them opportunities and support to prevent them from falling into delinquency. Sophia became actively involved in charity work, especially those focused on families in need. Lucy, for her part, found a new purpose. In addition to her role in the family, she began studying child psychology, inspired by her experience with Matthew and her desire to help other children who had been through difficult situations. Matthew grew up happy and secure, surrounded by the love of his extended family. His laughter filled the house, erasing the last vestiges of tension and fear that had once inhabited there. One afternoon, as the whole family was enjoying a barbecue in the garden, Lucy found herself observing the scene with a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. Alexander was at the grill, joking with Matthew as he cooked. Sophia was chatting animatedly with Mrs. Peterson, who had joined them for the occasion. "A penny for your thoughts," a voice said beside her. Lucy turned to see Sophia smiling at her. "I was just thinking about how much everything has changed," Lucy replied. "How lucky I am to be part of this." Sophia took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're the lucky ones, Lucy. You saved us, in more ways than one." Before Lucy could respond, Matthew ran up to them, his eyes bright with excitement. "Mom, Lucy, come on, Dad says it's time to eat." Laughing, the two women let themselves be dragged along by the boys' enthusiasm. As they sat around the garden table, Alexander raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, his gaze sweeping over the smiling faces around him. "To the bonds that unite us, stronger than blood. To the love that has carried us through darkness and brought us into the light. To family," they all repeated in unison, and as the sun set over Oakwood Estate, bathing the garden in a golden light, Lucy knew she had found her place in the world, in this family that had welcomed her, in this home they had built together, in this love that had overcome all tests. The nanny, who had once nervously arrived at a cold and distant mansion, had become an integral part of a warm and loving family. The secrets and dangers of the past had given way to a bright future full of hope. And so, in the twilight of a perfect day, surrounded by the people she loved and who loved her, Lucy smiled, knowing that this was just the first page of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter filled with love, laughter, and the promise of many more adventures to come